Imagine a country with the fourth largest oil reserves in the world, yet millions of its citizens can't afford basic food. This is Iran today. Skyrocketing inflation, a crashing currency, widespread poverty, a youth unemployment crisis. This is a nation on the brink of economic collapse. Despite its wealth in oil, decades of mismanagement, crippling sanctions, and political infighting have left Iran's economy gasping for air. But Iran wasn't always like this. Just 50 years ago, Iran was positioned to become one of the most prosperous nations in the Middle East. It had oil wealth, a growing middle class, educational institutions producing engineers, doctors, and scientists, strategic importance that made it a key partner to major powers. What happened? How does a country go from regional powerhouse to economic disaster? And more importantly, what does Iran's collapse mean for the rest of the world? By the end of this video, you will understand why Iran's economic crisis could have consequences not just for its citizens, but for the entire region and even the global oil market. You'll see how a combination of revolutionary ideology, international isolation, corruption, climate change, and geopolitical ambitions created a perfect storm of economic destruction. This is the story of how a nation rich in resources became poor in opportunities. Before we dive into the specific causes, let's understand just how severe Iran's economic crisis has become. The numbers are staggering. Inflation is approaching 50% annually. That means prices double roughly every 18 months. A meal that cost 100,000 riyals last year now costs 150,000. Next year, it could be 225,000. For people on fixed incomes, pensioners, government workers, teachers, this is catastrophic. The Iranian rial has collapsed to over 700,000 per US dollar. In 2015, before the reimposition of sanctions, the rate was around 30,000 rials per dollar. That's a loss of more than 95% of its value in less than a decade. Imagine watching your life savings evaporate. Your retirement funds shrink to almost nothing. Your ability to import medicine, food, or essential goods disappear. This is the reality for 85 million Iranians. Over 30 million people, nearly a third of the population, now live below the poverty line. In a country that was once solidly middle class, poverty has become the norm. Families that owned homes, sent their children to university, and took vacations now struggle to buy meat. Youth unemployment exceeds 30%. For young women, it's over 42%. An entire generation is locked out of the formal economy. Educated, skilled, and ambitious, but with nowhere to go. GDP has contracted significantly. Iran's economy shrank by nearly 7% in 2019 alone. While it has recovered slightly, growth remains anemic. Compare this to neighboring Turkey, which despite its own economic problems, still manages positive growth. Or the UAE, which has diversified away from oil and built a thriving services economy. Iran, by contrast, is stuck, trapped between sanctions, mismanagement, and political paralysis. And as we'll see, the crisis touches every aspect of Iranian life. Inflation in Iran is skyrocketing, approaching a staggering 50%. The Iranian rial has collapsed to over 700,000 per US dollar. For the average citizen, this isn't just a number. It's the difference between affording a loaf of bread or going hungry. Let's break down what this actually means. The daily reality. In Tehran, the capital, a kilo of chicken costs around 500,000 rials. That's roughly 70 cents in US dollars. Doesn't sound like much, right? But the average monthly salary in Iran is around 50 million rials. That's about $70 per month. So a single kilo of chicken represents 1% of a month's wages. Now, scale that up. Rent in Tehran averages 30 to 40 million rials per month for a modest apartment. That's more than half of the average salary, before buying food, before utilities, before transportation, before medicine. The math doesn't work. People are forced to make impossible choices. Pay rent, or buy food. Buy medicine, or pay for transportation to work. Send children to school or keep them home to save on supplies. Over 30 million Iranians, nearly a third of the population, now live below the poverty line. But this number doesn't capture the full story. Because Iran's poverty line is set incredibly low. It's measured by the ability to afford basic calories, not nutrition, not housing, not healthcare, just survival. Many Iranians who are technically above the poverty line are still struggling. The middle class, once the backbone of Iranian society, has been hollowed out. Families that owned homes now rent. Families that ate meat regularly now consider it a luxury. Families that could afford private health care now rely on overwhelmed public hospitals. Prices for essentials, food, medicine, housing, have surged while wages remain stagnant. The World Food Program estimates that millions of Iranians face food insecurity. Not starvation, but chronic uncertainty about where their next meal will come from. Families skip meals. Children go to school hungry. Parents sacrifice their own nutrition to feed their kids. Red meat has become a luxury item. Even staples like rice, bread, and cooking oil have become expensive relative to incomes. In 2022, the Iranian government cut subsidies on basic goods. For years, subsidies kept bread, fuel, and other essentials affordable. But as government revenues collapsed, so did the subsidies. Bread prices tripled overnight, cooking oil doubled, fuel prices soared. The immediate result? Protests, looting, desperation. The government partially reversed the cuts, but the damage was done, trust was broken, and the underlying problem that the government can't afford to subsidize basic goods anymore remains unsolved. Ordinary Iranians face an impossible reality: working harder just to survive, not to thrive. This creates a psychological crisis. Depression rates are rising. Drug addiction is increasing. Suicide rates, especially among young men, have climbed. When people lose hope, society begins to fracture. And as we'll see, this inflation crisis is just the tip of the iceberg. The collapse of the Iranian rial is one of the most dramatic currency crises in modern history. Understanding how it happened reveals much about Iran's broader economic dysfunction. The pre-sanction era. In 2012, before major international sanctions, the rial traded at around 12,000 per dollar. Not great, but manageable. Iran could import goods. Businesses could plan. Savings held value. Then came the sanctions. First from the US in 2012 over Iran's nuclear program. Then multilateral sanctions from the EU and UN. The rial began to fall. By 2015, it had dropped to 30,000 per dollar. In 2015, Iran signed the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear deal. Sanctions were partially lifted. Foreign investment began to flow. The rial stabilized. For a brief moment, there was hope. European companies signed contracts. Iranian businesses started expanding. The middle class felt relief, but it didn't last. In 2018, the United States withdrew from the nuclear deal and reimposed sanctions. The impact was immediate and devastating. Foreign companies fled. Oil exports plummeted. The rial went into freefall. By 2020, it had crashed past 200,000 per dollar. By 2022, it exceeded 400,000. Today, it hovers around 700,000. That's a 98% loss of value since 2012. Iran officially has two exchange rates: the official rate set by the central bank, and the black market rate, which reflects actual supply and demand. The gap between them is enormous. The official rate might be 50,000 rials per dollar. The black market, 700,000. This creates massive corruption opportunities. Those with access to official rates can buy dollars cheaply and sell them on the black market for huge profits. It's a system designed for insiders to get rich, while ordinary people suffer. Wealthy Iranians saw the writing on the wall. They moved money out of the country. Billions of dollars were converted to foreign currency and hidden abroad. Dubai became a haven for Iranian wealth. Real estate in Turkey, Canada, and Europe absorbed Iranian capital. This capital flight accelerated the rial's collapse. The more people tried to get out, the faster the currency fell. It became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Iran's central bank is now trapped. It can't defend the currency without foreign reserves. It can't rebuild reserves without oil exports. It can't increase oil exports without sanctions relief. and it can't get sanctions relief without political changes that seem unlikely. So the rial continues to sink, and with it, the savings and security of millions of Iranians. Unemployment in Iran is another ticking time bomb. Official numbers often underestimate the reality, but youth unemployment alone is around 30%. For young women, the figure is even higher, 42%. This isn't just an economic problem, it's a social crisis, a political powder keg, and a massive waste of human potential. Iran has one of the youngest populations in the Middle East. Over 60% of Iranians are under 30. This should be an advantage, a young, educated workforce, ready to drive innovation, build businesses, fuel growth. Instead, they're unemployed, or underemployed, or forced into the informal economy. Iran has a highly educated population. Literacy rates exceed 85%. University enrollment is high. Every year, hundreds of thousands of students graduate with degrees in engineering, computer science, medicine, and business. These are skills the modern economy needs, but Iran's economy can't absorb them. Why? Because the formal economy has collapsed. Industries have been decimated by international sanctions. Let's look at one example: the automobile sector. Iran used to have a thriving car industry. Companies like Iran Khodro and Saipa produced millions of vehicles annually. They employed hundreds of thousands of workers, not just assembly line workers, but engineers, designers, supply chain managers, and salespeople. The industry was a symbol of Iran's industrial ambitions. Then came sanctions. Foreign partners, Peugeot, Renault, Mercedes, pulled out. Access to parts dried up. Technology stagnated. Quality plummeted. Factories shut down, leaving skilled workers without jobs. Production collapsed by over 60%. Today, Iranian cars are outdated, unreliable, and expensive. The industry survives only because of captive domestic demand and import restrictions. It's a zombie industry, alive but not thriving. Faced with no opportunities at home, Iran's best and brightest leave. This is called brain drain, and it's devastating. Estimates suggest that over 150,000 educated Iranians emigrate every year. They go to Canada, Germany, the United States, Australia, the UAE, and anywhere that offers opportunity. Iran invests in their education, then loses them to other countries. It's economic suicide. Meanwhile, the black market economy thrives, estimated at over $10 billion. But this number is almost certainly an undercount. The true informal economy could be 30 to 40% of GDP. People are forced to turn to informal trade just to survive. Street vendors, unlicensed taxis, underground workshops, smuggling. This activity generates income, but it doesn't pay taxes, depriving the government of revenue. It doesn't provide benefits, leaving workers vulnerable. It doesn't build institutional capacity. It further weakens the formal economy. The situation is particularly dire for women. Female unemployment exceeds 42%. Iran has one of the lowest female labor force participation rates in the world. Only about 16% of Iranian women work in the formal economy. This is partly cultural, partly religious, but it's also economic. When jobs are scarce, women are often the first to be excluded. This represents an enormous waste of talent. Countries that exclude half their population from the workforce cannot compete globally. The dreams of a generation are being stifled by policies and circumstances beyond their control. Young Iranians are more connected to the world than any previous generation, more educated, more ambitious, but they see no future. This creates a dangerous mix of frustration and hopelessness. Some protest, some emigrate, some turn to drugs, some simply give up. This is not just an economic tragedy, it's a human one. To understand Iran's economic collapse, we must understand sanctions. Because no single factor has damaged Iran's economy more than international isolation. Sanctions on Iran began in 1979 after the Islamic Revolution and the hostage crisis. But they were relatively limited. The real escalation began in the 2000s as Iran's nuclear program advanced. The US, EU, and UN imposed increasingly severe restrictions. By 2012, sanctions targeted Iran's central bank, oil exports, financial transactions, shipping, and insurance. These weren't just economic measures. They were designed to cripple Iran's ability to function in the global economy. Modern sanctions are sophisticated. They don't just ban trade, they cut countries off from the global financial system. Iran cannot use SWIFT, the international banking network. This means Iranian banks cannot easily transfer money internationally. Want to buy goods from China? You can't just wire the payment. You need to use intermediaries, shell companies, and creative accounting, all of which add cost and risk. Oil is Iran's economic lifeline. Before sanctions, Iran exported 2.5 million barrels per day. After sanctions, that dropped to under 500,000. Even today, with some evasion, exports remain around 1 million barrels per day. That's a revenue loss of billions of dollars annually. The most powerful tool the US uses is secondary sanctions. These punish anyone who does business with Iran, even if they're not American. A Chinese company that buys Iranian oil risks being cut off from the US financial system. A European bank that processes Iranian payments could face massive fines. This forces companies worldwide to choose: do business with Iran, or do business with the US and the West. For most companies, the choice is obvious. The US market is too big to lose, so they abandon Iran. Officially, sanctions allow humanitarian goods like medicine and food. In practice, the restrictions are so complex that companies avoid Iran entirely. Banks refuse to process payments, even for medicine. Shipping companies won't deliver, even for food. The result? Medicine shortages, medical equipment that can't be imported or maintained, patients dying from treatable conditions. Critics call this collective punishment. Supporters argue it pressures the regime to change behavior, but the reality is that ordinary Iranians bear the cost. Iran has developed sophisticated evasion techniques, smuggling oil through third countries, using cryptocurrency for payments, operating front companies in Dubai and Turkey, ship-to-ship transfers in international waters to hide oil origins. These methods work, but they're expensive, risky, limited in scale, and they can't fully replace legitimate trade. Sanctions were supposed to bring Iran to the negotiating table, and they did in 2015, leading to the nuclear deal. But when the US withdrew in 2018, the entire framework collapsed. Now Iran is caught between hardliners who refuse to compromise, international demands that seem impossible to meet, economic pressure that's unbearable. There's no clear path forward, and while politicians argue, ordinary Iranians suffer. You might wonder, how can a country with the fourth largest oil reserves in the world struggle so badly? The answer lies in a dangerous combination of mismanagement, sanctions, and global market pressures. Economists call this the resource curse. Countries with abundant natural resources often develop economies overly dependent on a single commodity, neglect other industries, suffer from corruption as elites fight over resource wealth, fail to invest in education, infrastructure, and diversification. Iran is a textbook case. Oil has dominated Iran's economy since the 1950s. In good times, oil revenue funded government budgets, subsidies, infrastructure, and the military. In bad times, when oil prices fell or sanctions limited sales, the entire economy collapsed. Iran never seriously diversified. There was always the temptation to just pump more oil. Why invest in manufacturing when oil is easy money? Why build a services economy when oil revenue flows in? This short-term thinking created long-term vulnerability. Iran's oil revenue, once the backbone of its economy, has been decimated. Sanctions prevent regular oil sales, forcing Iran to sell crude at heavy discounts to China. Let me explain how this works. Before sanctions, Iran sold oil on the open market at market prices. If oil was trading at $80 per barrel, Iran received roughly that. Now, Iran must sell secretly, avoiding detection, offer discounts to compensate buyers for the risk, use complex shipping arrangements that add cost. The result? Iran might receive $50 to $60 per barrel when the market price is $80. That's a 25 to 30% haircut. And since volume is also down, total revenue has collapsed by 60 to 70%. At the same time, rising global food prices and extensive military spending are draining resources. Iran spends enormous sums on the Revolutionary Guard proxy forces in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Yemen. Missile programs, drone development, and nuclear research estimates suggest 15 to 20% of the government budget goes to military and security. In absolute terms, that's $15 to $20 billion per year. Compare this to education, which receives about $10 billion, or healthcare, which gets even less. With limited funds for healthcare, education, and infrastructure, ordinary citizens bear the brunt. The lack of diverse industries and foreign investment leaves Iran economically isolated. Iran has tried to develop non-oil sectors, petrochemicals, agriculture, tourism, and technology. But sanctions make it nearly impossible. Technology companies can't import advanced chips. Tourism is minimal due to political tensions. Agriculture suffers from water shortages. Petrochemicals are subject to sanctions. Iran is trapped, dependent on oil, unable to sell oil effectively, unable to develop alternatives, and with few alternatives to generate jobs and growth. Iran also faces another natural issue which has not been easy. Climate change is adding a new layer of complexity to Iran's economic troubles. Droughts and water shortages have devastated agriculture. Rural families, unable to survive off the land, are forced to migrate to already overcrowded cities. Iran is experiencing one of the worst water crises in the world. Rivers that flowed for thousands of years have dried up. Lake Urmia, once the largest lake in the Middle East, has shrunk by 90%. Groundwater levels are plummeting. Why? Climate change, rising temperatures and reduced rainfall, mismanagement, dams built without proper planning, over-extraction, farmers pumping groundwater unsustainably, corruption, water resources diverted to politically connected farms. Agriculture employs about 20% of Iran's workforce, but it's collapsing. Crop yields are falling. Livestock is dying. Farmers are abandoning their land. Provinces like Khuzestan and Sistan-Baluchistan, once agricultural heartlands, are now dust bowls. Rural families, unable to survive off the land, are forced to migrate to already overcrowded cities. Tehran's population has exploded. So has Mashhad, Isfahan, and other urban centers. This mass migration worsens unemployment and strains urban infrastructure. Cities can't provide housing for all the newcomers, jobs for displaced farmers, schools for migrant children, healthcare for growing populations. The result is sprawling slums, overcrowded schools, overwhelmed hospitals, rising crime, inflation, scarcity, and unemployment combine to create a vicious cycle of poverty and frustration. Migrants can't find work in cities. They can't return to rural areas where there's no water. They're trapped. And their desperation fuels protests, crime, social instability. Water has become a political issue. Protests over water shortages have erupted in Khuzestan, Isfahan, and Sistan-Baluchistan. These protests are often met with violence. The government sees them as threats to stability. But the underlying problem, water scarcity, remains unresolved. For many Iranians, life has become a daily struggle to simply survive. No discussion of Iran's economy is complete without mentioning the nuclear program. Because the nuclear program is directly tied to sanctions, which are directly tied to economic collapse. Iran insists its nuclear program is for peaceful energy production. Western powers suspect Iran wants nuclear weapons capability. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Iran wants the option to build weapons if needed, but it hasn't yet crossed that line. The nuclear program has cost Iran enormously. Direct costs, billions spent on centrifuges, facilities, and research. Sanctions, trillions in lost economic activity due to isolation. lost investment, foreign companies that would have invested but stayed away. Was it worth it? From the regime's perspective, perhaps. Nuclear capability provides deterrence against foreign attack, negotiating leverage, national pride. But from an economic perspective, the cost has been catastrophic. The 2015 nuclear deal offered a way out. Iran would limit enrichment, allow inspections, and verifiably remain non-nuclear. In exchange, sanctions would be lifted, trade would resume, investment would flow. For a few years, it worked. Iran's economy began recovering. Then the U.S. withdrew. Today, negotiations are stalled. Iran has increased enrichment, reduced cooperation with inspectors, and advanced missile technology. The West has maintained sanctions, threatened more restrictions, and refused to rejoin the deal without new terms. Neither side can afford to back down politically, but economically, Iran is bleeding. Every year this continues, the economic damage deepens. The story of Iran is a cautionary tale of how wealth can be wasted, potential squandered, and citizens left behind. It's a story of revolutionary idealism turned to repression, oil riches turned to poverty, regional ambition turned to isolation, educational achievement turned to brain drain. The coming years will be critical. Either Iran finds a path toward reform and economic resilience, or the crisis deepens, with consequences far beyond its borders. For 85 million Iranians, the choice is stark. Continue suffering under a system that cannot deliver prosperity, or demand change despite the risks. For the world, the stakes are equally high. A stable Iran could be a partner in regional security and global energy markets. A collapsed Iran could unleash chaos across the Middle East. If you want to understand global economic crises, energy markets, and the human cost of political decisions, Iran's story is one to watch closely. Because what happens in Iran doesn't stay in Iran. It affects oil prices in Europe, security calculations in Washington, refugee flows to neighboring countries, the balance of power in the Middle East, and the future of millions of people who deserve better than what they've been given. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell if you want more deep dives into the world's most pressing crises. Comment below, what do you think is the solution for Iran's economic collapse? Should sanctions be lifted? Should the regime reform? Or is the situation beyond saving? Let's discuss.